celebrating his young, lovely wife. We do have some, again, there's a book back there. I know a couple of people expressed some interest in it. You know, we don't make any money off the book, but if you'd like to buy one, we'll give it to you for like 20% off the price at Amazon. If you're an entrepreneur, you can actually sell it right after you buy it. $10. But again, that's not our mission, is to hit you up for money. Okay, so we just about got everybody with a seat. I'm going to introduce Dr. Freamon. He's from Seton Hall Law School, and we had breakfast this morning. He tells me it's 4 degrees up there. And so I know that he's happy to be in Texas, so let's give him a big Texas welcome. He will give you some background about himself.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege for me to talk to you about this topic, and I trust the same will be true for you when I'm done. I'm very happy to see that you're all here to learn about this important topic, rather than standing in line trying to get tickets for 50 Shades of Grey. This is much better than doing that. So I can talk a little bit about myself first. I have a PowerPoint. Some of the, I'm not great with PowerPoint because I'm of the older generation. So some of the print may be hard for you to see, and I'll go through it carefully. This PowerPoint is copyrighted, so if there's a copyright notice on it. So if anyone wants permission to use it or to print it or otherwise disseminate it, you have to get my permission to do that. Otherwise, I'll sue you. So just want to make that clear. I am a New Yorker. I was born in New York. My father was in the Army. I spent most of my life moving from Army base to Army base. We lived all over the U.S. and also in Germany. And then we settled in Newark, New Jersey. My father was an Army recruiter during the Vietnam War, and he was the chief recruiter for northern New Jersey, and that's where I went to high school. And then I went to college in Connecticut, and then law school back in Newark, where my mother lived, and that is sort of a thumbnail sketch of my early life. I became a lawyer in New Jersey in 1974. By then, I was already Muslim. Becoming Muslim was one of the best things I've ever done in my life. Only one thing better than that. That was having my daughter. I didn't have her, but my wife at that time had her. But having and raising a daughter. But next to having a wonderful daughter, becoming Muslim was really an important and very significant aspect of my life. This hat that I have on, I know it doesn't, the ladies will notice it doesn't match the rest of the outfit, but it's a Kurdish hat, which I had originally. Kurdish hats are very good to wear. Muslims like to wear them, and Kurdish people are important in what's going on today. And I had a judge who bought me a Kurdish hat, and then I lost it. So when I got to Turkey, the next time I went to Turkey, I replaced it with this hat. Your speaker, the organizer here, talked about why do people become Muslim, and he said it's because your parents were Muslim or your grandparents were Muslim. It's not true for me, and it's not true for a lot of Muslims. I became Muslim. I traveled to Algeria as a student in 1969, and I was disenchanted with Christianity. My grandmother was a very good Christian, God rest her soul, and I grew up in a household. My mother was also a pretty good Christian, and not as good as my grandmother, but pretty good. And I grew up in a household where there were morals and right and wrong and all of that, and I was still disenchanted with it. Part of it was because I was African American and the churches were segregated. I didn't understand why churches were segregated, why all the blacks went to one church, all the whites went to another church. That was part of my disenchantment with it, and also I had just some difficulty understanding some of the things that were going on in the Christian church that my grandmother was involved in. And I traveled to Algeria as a student. And one of the important messages of Islam is a message of human equality. And I was talked to by a man named Rashid when I was in Algeria. I was just there on a journalism project. As a journalism, doing a project for school. I spent about 2 months in Algeria and Morocco. And he took me to a mosque. And I, for the first time, I didn't know much about Islam until I got there. I saw things that were different than I expected. And I began to read and study and think about it, and converted to Islam while there in Algeria. And when I came back, Professor Autocracy was very right about what happened when I came back and I told my grandmother that I had converted to Islam. She was not happy about it. And it caused a lot of discussion in the family and everything like that. But eventually she accepted it, and you know what? She eventually herself took a trip to Morocco as a tourist, and we ultimately had ended up with a very good understanding of what happened to me. So I think I'd tell you that to say that there are many, many Muslims in the world, and one of the things that I'm going to try and emphasize in my talk, and I may talk too long, but one of the things I'm going to try and emphasize in my talk is that if anyone comes to you with this problem with ISIS, or any of these problems with respect to Islam in the world, and tries to give you cookie-cutter, quick fix solutions to this problem, you should be suspicious and question and be critical about it. This is a very difficult, complex problem that we are dealing with. For Muslims, it's difficult and complex. And dealing with what's going on with Islam, the Muslims have to ask themselves a lot of questions about what's happening now. And it's also difficult and complex for the non-Muslims in the world. And there are two great groups of non-Muslims in the world that we have to be concerned with. There are Europeans and Americans and people in the Western part of the world, but there's also China and the Far East, where also the Chinese are also having to deal with an aspect of their population that is Muslim. And the Chinese approach to things is generally to keep religion completely out of any kind of the public square, left over from the old communist approach to things. And so the Chinese, as well as other aspects of the Far East and Southeast Asia, that's also an issue there. So this is a very big, very complex, and as I've said already, complicated problem, and it is not one which is going to lend itself to cookie cutter or quick fix, or this is the truth and this is not the truth kinds of solutions. Anyone who says to you, this is the truth and this is a lie, you should be suspicious of, because oftentimes with things having to do with politics and religion, it's somewhere in between. And the story is not always the way that someone wants to say it. So one thing about who becomes Muslim, for example, the Islamic world is only 22% Arab. 80-some-odd% when you do the math, I guess it's 78% of the Muslim world is non-Arab. How did all those people become Muslims? Because the Islamic religion originally was an Arab religion. Came out of the Arab culture and the Arab nation. 78% now of the people that profess Islam are not Arab. That means that they're like me, that they converted. Pakistanis, the large population of Muslims in Pakistan, were originally Hindu. The largest Muslim country in the world, I think, is Indonesia. Might be Malaysia, one of the two, I don't recall. But originally they were Buddhist and Hindu. Originally they were not Islamic. Same in China. The Uyghur people of China, on Western China, were originally of other religions. So, what is the attractiveness of Islam to all of these folks, the 78% of the people who have become Muslim in terms of the Islamic world? Part of it is that message of human equality. When you're in the mosque, and I noticed that when I became Muslim, when you're in religious organizations or religious discourse, there is no distinction made between anyone on the basis of race or ethnicity or language. There are Arabs who think that to some extent the Arab approach to the religion is superior to a non-Arab approach. The Quran is in Arabic. And there are many Arabs who might say, well, I can have a better understanding of it because that's my native language. Like a Jewish person who speaks Hebrew might say, I have a better understanding of the Torah because it's in Hebrew. And to some extent, there's something to be said for that it's important to be able to read that language and have a native understanding of the language. But most of the Muslim world doesn't read Arabic and doesn't speak Arabic. Yet, many, many, many people in the Muslim world are very serious about the religion and are glad, like me, that they have become Muslim. And my second marriage was to a very devout and pious Muslim woman. She raised my daughter, who was not her daughter, just like her own daughter. In fact, she's closer to my daughter than my daughter's natural mother. And my daughter became Muslim, and we have a very good, close family relationship that I'm thankful about every single day of my life. So Islam gave to me something I was not getting from the situation I was in New York when I was in college and high school in New Jersey. The relationships that I had at that time. And so I am appreciative of it, and I hope that comes through in my talk. Not that this situation with ISIS is something, I'm not here to apologize for ISIS, that's for sure. It's something that should really be of concern to serious Muslims, and I'm one of them. But I'm not here to, don't mistake the fact that I'm going to come here and try to, trash Islam, because for me, Islam is a very important part of my life. And I think I've made the message already as to why it's the fastest growing religion. Professor Autocracy said it's the fastest growing religion in the world today, and that's true. In spite of all of this negative press and the bad behavior that's going on, burning up hostages, burning this man alive on video, that's really, really bad. Terrible behavior. And yet still, and after 9/11, and even after these events, people are still flocking to the religion. In Europe, especially, people are flocking to the religion. So there's much more to the religion than this information you get from the press and from various writers and the internet about the bad aspects of what Muslims do. We have a saying, we Muslims have a saying, which generally works, is that Islam would be great if it weren't for the Muslims. We say that also about being, as law professors, teaching would be good if it weren't for students. And it's the same kind of thing, is that the message of Islam is very good, it's just that Muslims sometimes get it wrong. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So it's the fastest growing religion because of the message of equality, the message of a spiritual home and warmth and spiritual closeness its message in terms of family relationships and the importance of family relationships, and its message in terms of being able to distinguish between right and wrong. And there's a lot of reasons for that people aren't finding in whatever they are doing, either in Europe or in China or in the US. For some reason, people are not finding that kind of message. Look at these 3 kids who just got killed in North Carolina the other day by this apparently a crazy guy who was upset about a parking space and went and shot these 2 kids and her sister, the wife's sister. And they were just young kids at the University of North Carolina, who were good students, all just really just ordinary people. And and that's the kind of family relationship that you can see. And so you have, people are coming to the religion because a lot of those kinds of things. So let me just get to the topic here, and then you can ask me questions. I'll take any question you want to ask. You don't have to limit your question to just about ISIS. If you have any other question about me personally, or about the religion, or about what you've heard, feel free to ask that. So let me go to if this will work. What is happening? And I put this on the board. What we are witnessing is a worldwide resurgence. Some call it a reawakening, which in Arabic is called the Nakhda, or a awakening, or reawakening, or revival, if you want to call it that. You've had revivals in other religions as well. And what's happening with Islam is a worldwide revival of the Islamic way of thinking. And so I have looked at, from a historical purpose, what I do in my everyday life is Islamic legal history. And my specialty is on slavery. That's what I do to earn my pay at the university, is to write and teach about slavery. Not just Islamic slavery in the Islamic world, slavery generally, but particularly slavery in the Muslim world, the Indian Ocean world generally. And so I'm a historian, a legal historian, and so what I've done is just taken some markers, and this will have to be very quick, of what are some of the markers. They're not necessarily causes, but markers of this revival that's going on. One, the first is the collapse of the colonial era in the Muslim world. There had been, and I'll talk more about this today, there had been a very vibrant Islamic political establishment established in mostly the Indian Ocean world up to about the 16th or 17th century. You had first the Abbasid Caliphate, which was based in Baghdad, which lasted for 500 years, from 750 AD to about 1250 AD, before the Mongols invaded Baghdad. You also had the Ottoman Empire, which was established shortly after that and lasted into the 20th century. But the early days of the Ottoman Empire, which was based in Turkey, were particularly important. You had other sultanates, and some called them caliphates, around the world, where the idea of government, the idea of social relationships, the idea of law and marriage and divorce and business, doing business and all of that came out of an Islamic perspective. Then the Islamic world fell into decline for reasons that no one's quite sure of. It fell into decline, and at the same time you had the rise of European colonialism. That's what created what we have here today in the US. The British, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, Germany to some extent, Denmark, all left Europe, went into the rest of the world searching for markets, searching for places to expand their politics and economics, and the Islamic world became subject to that. And so Egypt, Iraq, the coast of East Africa, West Africa, and Southeast Asia all came under colonial rule. Then, at the end of the 19th century, that collapsed. When it collapsed, there was nothing to put in its place. And so many, many people began to say, well, let's restore Islam. So there's, some Muslims disagree with me on this, but I've had arguments with Muslims about it, but I would say it. There's this kind of nostalgia, or in my point of view, a longing to go back to the glory days of early Islam, basically based in Baghdad, where there were, and I'll talk more about this, where there was really it was a good place to live. And you could get educated, make money, raise your family. It was peaceful. Baghdad is called the city of peace. It's also called the city of blood, but it has those two names in Arabic, the city of peace and the city of blood. And so that collapsed. And so when it collapsed, there's this longing to come back to Islam. That's number one. Number two, we had out of the Enlightenment, at the same time that the colonial era came to an end, we had these Enlightenment ideas, which during that same time were imposed on people in the Muslim world without really much thinking about it, and we still tend to do that. I would say that the Americans are good at that too. There's a lot that's good about America and the ideas of American democracy. But George Bush tried to impose American democracy on Iraq. And you just can't go up to someone and say, you know, tomorrow you're going to be democratic. And you're going to go, it's even true in Jersey, in New Jersey. They tried to do that in Jersey City, and it doesn't work. There's an old saying in Jersey City, which is that, you know, there's two resurrection days, Easter and Election Day. Why? Because on Election Day, people come back from the dead and vote. And the same thing is true in Baghdad. You just can't come and say, all right, tomorrow you're going to be democratic. And you're going to vote as you want to vote. And it'll be honest and non-corrupt and all that kind of thing. And there are a lot of other Enlightenment ideas that were imposed, and it really didn't work. And so people again say, well, rather than accept this idea, which is a foreign idea, and just accept it because you tell me you accept it, I'll go back to the ideas I know, which a lot of them are Islamic. I'm not talking much about globalization of markets. I could talk about it. There's a whole lot of economics that are connected with this, but time doesn't permit it. But in the colonial era, one of the things about the colonial era and the post-colonial era, and even now, is the globalization of markets. That the Western governments are always looking for more markets. You know, this kind of thing. Like jeans. You know, who's it that makes jeans? Gap, I guess. One of these companies. They love to sell jeans, and they just got everybody through media to buy jeans, blue jeans. And so these kinds of things happened as well, but I won't spend much time with that because time doesn't permit it. Wahhabism. Wahhabism is a complicated topic. Some call it Salafism. There's a little bit of a difference. But the idea, there was a revolution in Arabia in the right around the time of the American Revolution. A man by the name of Abdel Wahab took over the government. He was a preacher who enabled the Saudi family to establish itself in Arabia. But the Abdel Wahab was really what we would describe, if you were to analogize it in the Christian religion, he was a Unitarian. He's a Puritan. His idea, And those ideas that come from Wahhabism are Puritan ideas, that you don't want anything to sully the central message of Islam. So don't go to graves and give homage to dead people. Don't have pilgrimages to shrines. Don't put anything up on the wall that would have anything to do with adulation of a human being. We worship God and only God, and nothing else but God. And anything that sullies that has to be eliminated. Like much in the desert, because of the way, the harshness of the desert life, the attitude is one of eliminating it very rapidly. And so Wahhabism developed in the 19th century and the early 20th century after the revolution in Arabia, which really was a coup, and it spread around the Islamic world rather rapidly to India and other places as well. And it's still a very strong factor in some of this stuff that's going on with ISIS, because ISIS borrows the ideas of the Wahhabis, because the Wahhabis really are anti-Shia. It's a whole complicated history in terms of the relationship between the Sunnis and the Shia. And the Wahhabis don't agree that the Shia should be counted as Muslims, because the Shia do tend to go to shrines, worship at shrines, put pictures up on the wall of people who are important in the religion. They have a different approach, to some extent, to worship in the religion, and the Wahhabis see that as an anathema. And so the ISIS people have adopted that ideology, and that's what's driving a lot of what's going on with ISIS. The Islamic world, up until the 19th century, the empires that were built, those empires that I talked about, the Baghdad Empire, Egypt, the Mamluk Empire, Southeast Asia, those empires were based, like the Western colonial empires do, on slavery. No different than what happened with Europe. I am here because my great-great-grandfather was brought here as a slave. You have many people in the Muslim world who are there because their great-great-grandfather was brought to that place as a slave. So you had this regime of slavery. In the West, we had the Civil War, and the British, they woke up one morning and they said, you know what, we got to stop doing this slavery thing, and they just decided they would not do it anymore. And you had other war, Brazil, Cuba, there were big problems with slavery. That didn't happen in the Muslim world. What happened in the Muslim world, rather than people actually talking about slavery and dealing with the problem of slavery, the colonials just came in and said, don't do this anymore, it's wrong. But what they substituted for it was a regime of human trafficking. So Indians were taken all over the world to do work. Southeast Asians were taken all over the world to do work, to working mines and on plantations and things like that. And the Western people said, well, it's not really slavery, we're not paying you anything, and you're living in a dorm and you have all kinds of problems, but we've eliminated slavery. And so to some extent, that also bothered the Muslims because of that, because it's the same. They didn't understand the difference. Maybe there is no difference. That's a very complicated problem. But I listed as one of the markers, which is that you have, India is a really huge problem. Pakistan is a big problem with human trafficking. So if someone who is in that circumstance, and someone comes to them and says, you know, I could get you out of this situation, but just listen to me, and I'll teach you a religion that's going to, the aspects of a religion that will help you escape from the situation you're in, that person will listen to that. So human trafficking is one of the real issues. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which is also too complicated to go in with any detail here. It's just that the Ottomans chose the wrong side in World War I. They went with the Germans and they lost, as we know. And so the Ottomans, who had done a lot of good things, the Turkish Empire had done a lot of good things for the Islamic world, just made politically poor choices toward the end. And so then those who liked that life they were living under then also began to look for other ways. You had the rise of national liberation movements after colonialism in Asia and Africa. This is also a long story, but you had people who were saying, we need independence, freedom. And so you had the Algerian War with France. It started in 1954, lasted up until, I think, 1962, when de Gaulle said, okay, you can have independence. You had the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya. You had the Indian independence, which wasn't the result of a war, but you have a lot of national liberation movements that arose. Some of those movements borrowed from Islam, because Islam teaches ideas about freedom and equality. And so that was one way, and people never forgot that. Frantz Fanon has a book. Frantz Fanon is dead now. He was a psychiatrist who worked in Algeria, and he wrote a very good book. I was reading when I became a Muslim in Algeria in 1969, and it's called The Wretched of the Earth. And in that book, it talks about a lot of things. He was a psychiatrist working. The French were torturing people in the Algerian Revolution. They would, I don't know if you've ever seen the film, The Battle of Algiers, where they would get people, they were trying to get information from someone, still going on today. They would get this person in, put a blowtorch to them, beat their testicles, beat them on the feet. And then Fanon, the psychiatrist working for the Algerians, would have to treat the aftermath of some of this, and then he began to get ideas about why. That's why he named it The Wretched of the Earth. What was going on with these Algerian peasants, really, who were fighting this revolution? What motivated them to fight this revolution, to overthrow the French? And he comes up with a lot of different ideas in that book that are still important. But one of them is the leadership style of the people who took over from the French. They were actually worse than the French in Algeria. So the autocrats that took over in the Islamic world actually sort of contributed to this problem that we're dealing with now. So you have people like Mubarak in Egypt, and now the current leader of Egypt, Sisi. Hafez al-Assad and his son, Bashar, in Syria. The Saudi kings and the leaders of the Persian Gulf Emirates are all autocrats. You cannot criticize them. If you do criticize, Sisi's police shot this woman in Tahrir the other day for laying flowers on a memorial, and she was shot to death. These kinds of autocratic, very fascist behaviors of people that took over in the Islamic world after the colonial era ended. So that's also a problem. The creation of Israel, I put on the list. Whatever your debate is about, there are some who say that the Zionists have a right to have a homeland. That may or may not be true. I don't want to get into that position. But there are many, many, many people displaced by the creation of Israel. Christians and Muslims, not just Muslims. Mostly Arabs displaced by the creation of Israel, and that caused resentment as well. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Some of you may be more familiar with that story. Again, Afghanistan has been a colonial prize going back to, guess how far back? People have been trying to get control of Afghanistan. Goes all the way back to Alexander the Great. If you go to Afghanistan, you will see forts built by Alexander the Great. So Afghanistan has been a prize. For what reason? I don't know. It doesn't seem to be. They say there's like all this mineral wealth below the mountains. I don't know. Opium, there's all kinds of things that go on in Afghanistan. But it's been back and forth, including the Soviets in the 1800s. That's really the genesis of Al-Qaeda. It's how Osama bin Laden got the idea to start this organization as a result of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Iran is a difficult thing to categorize. I debated not putting it on this list because you have autocratic rule in Iran, but it's Shia and it's just a little different. And I don't really know how I come out on it, but the Iranian Revolution, the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini, the Iran hostage crisis and all of that gave a lot of message to Muslims around the world that maybe we could establish an Islamic government that might work. Because that was the Ayatollah Khomeini's idea. Before that, you had an autocrat, a post-colonial autocrat in Iran, and it was the Shah of Iran. And he was the same as these other autocrats that I've talked about. Either you agree with me, or you end up in prison. And so they overthrew the Shah of Iran with an Islamic revolution, and that message also heartened people that have a nostalgia to restore Islamic government. And the Iraq War, as I've talked about already, is one of the markers. So, we then have, since really about the 1970s or early 80s, all these groups, and I won't go through them all, but I think one of the messages of my talk is that making war on ISIS and eliminating ISIS is not going to solve the problem. We could line up all the members of ISIS and shoot them out back here. Line them all up, try them in court if you want, and shoot them, or hang them, or imprison them. And it won't solve this problem. Because you have all these groups that have come out of, like Boko Haram in Nigeria, is a similar kind of phenomenon, and worse, actually, in many, many ways. I was really upset because I think 2 weeks ago, Boko Haram invaded a town and killed 2,000 people. 2,000 innocent people in the name of Islam. And when you go on the Yahoo News, you know what the headline on the Yahoo News was? What Taylor Swift wore at the Grammys. You know, or you have other things about, you know, celebrities and various things. So the news media is not really covering the seriousness of this insurgency, the rise of this insurgency. And Boko Haram is something that would be the topic of another talk. Today we're talking about ISIS, but Boko Haram is a really important a set of events going on. And I've just put some of the other groups on the list that have emerged out of this post-colonial circumstances, where I would call them Muslim insurgencies who are looking to establish Islamic government and Islamic governance in various permutations in various places. Some more radical than others. It doesn't help to just use the moniker radical Islam or extreme Islam or Salafism or whatever, or jihadism. It doesn't help, it's cookie cutter. It's essentialism. It's just like, I'm going to put all of these people in one big category. It's not the truth. It's not the accurate. It's not accurate. I can't say it's not true, but it's not accurate. It doesn't help understanding the situation. There's a big difference, for example, between the Muslim Brotherhood and ISIS. There's also a big difference between Hezbollah, which is Shia, and ISIS. If ISIS comes in counter with the Hezbollah fighters, there would be a war. Hezbollah supports the government in Syria. It's complicated. There's a big difference between Hamas and some of these other groups, because Hamas comes out of the creation of Israel. So don't sign up for this, like, I have to just battle all of these or be vigilant against this sort of category called radical Islam, because it's not really adequate to describe the circumstance. And the person talked about Texas textbooks and history textbooks and what should be taught in high schools and colleges and things like that. This is one of the most important things, is to describe this sets of events that I've described in the last few minutes, rather than just categorize it all in one topic. So what are some of the human characteristics, I just want to spend time on this, that cause people to join one or more of these organizations? Let's just focus on ISIS. The first thing I put on top is anomie. Does anybody know what anomie is? Yes, sir. What would you say anomie is?
It's a breakdown of the worldview and lifestyle.
Yes, it's a breakdown of the moral climate or structure that gets people to do the right thing on a daily basis. To some extent we have it in some places in the US, like in the South Bronx. There's another place where you have anomie. It used to, not anymore. Fort Apache in the South Bronx, you know, where you have drug gangs in Mexico, where, you know, you can kill 43 students and no one pays attention to it. That's another example of anomie. It was a term used by the sociologist Emil Durkheim in the 19th century to describe what was going on, to some extent, having to do with why people commit suicide. Why you can have a rise in suicide in the country, in the neighborhood or whatever. And so it's now been used by many sociologists to describe a breakdown in morality. That has happened in a large place, many places in the Muslim world. And it happens because of the other things largely on this list. I don't know the reasons for it, but I know it when I see it. I worked in Egypt for 17 years. I took students to Egypt for the revolution, and even after the revolution, before the current government, for 17 years, law students. And sometimes I have 50 law students in Egypt. And we would encounter young men especially young men, in cafes, internet cafes, in the library, in various places, and these young men, aimless, no future, no education, no real sense of who they are. And so they're just lost. And so I put some of those things on the list. Alienation, which is like no real identification with whatever is being told that they should sign up for. Join the army! Go fight here! And they would say, why? I don't want to do that. Why would I do that? Other than to pay. To get paid, but otherwise it doesn't make any sense. Jobs where there's no pay. Yeah, we would get in a taxi cab, and you'd find that the taxi driver has a PhD in economics. But why is he driving a taxi? Because there are no jobs for PhDs in economics. And that's the only way he can make a living. Islamic law, which has a lot to say about these topics, was cabined or categorized. The only time Islamic law would be important would be in family relations, but otherwise Islamic law does not matter. And a person who's religious, like a person who's Jewish or a person who's Christian, wants to be able to have that religious law to some extent influence decisions that they make. And so there was upsetment about the cabining of Islamic law. Materialism, I've talked about. Human trafficking. Bashing, especially of Arab culture. There's a lot of bashing of Arab culture. You know, there's a lot of stereotypes about Arabs, various things like that, which causes people to be upset. And economic inequality. We have the same thing here in this country, but it's worse choice in that part of the world. You're either very wealthy and doing very well, or you can't make it at all. You don't know where you're going to get your next dollar from, or dinar, or whatever it is. And there's nothing in between. Egypt's a little better. Egypt has somewhat of a middle class, but in many of these countries there is no middle class. It's either you're very wealthy or you are dirt poor. And we've talked about environmental things are also very important. When things happen like storms, or drought, or other kinds of things coming from the environment, the government is unable to respond to it. So if there's a disaster, the people turn to the Islamic people to treat people, save people in terms of hospital, or if you have a problem with everybody has problems with a little 14-year-old teenage kid. And so you need a social worker or to be involved with someone to deal with the rebellious 14-year-old kid. The government isn't supplying that. And so people go to the Islamic organizations who are much better at dealing, including things with the environment. So if there's a fire, if there's an earthquake, if there's a storm, this happened in Southeast Asia as well. It's the Islamic organizations that are able to stand up and deal with it. The government is looked upon as useless. So, the thing about ISIS is that it has attempted to replicate what's called the Abbasid Revolution. And this is a long, complicated story. Not complicated, it's not really complicated, it's just that time doesn't permit a whole lot of discussion of the early Islamic history. But you should know that after the Prophet Muhammad died, the first four caliphs that were described as caliph, caliph means in Arabic successor, person who steps in the shoes of the former person. And the first four were without dispute. The last, Ali, who was his son-in-law, there was a dispute and a civil war with respect to whether he should be caliph, or whether he actually was doing the job, and Umayyads took over. And they moved the caliphate from Medina in Arabia to Damascus in Syria. And the Umayyads were dynastic. In other words, they were like, monarchical. I am in this job because I inherited this job from my father and from my grandfather. Islam actually is against that idea. The Sunni Islamic approach to these things is the best qualified person should be in charge of the government. And so you had a revolution led by actually people who followed, but he was only used as a figurehead, an uncle of the Prophet Muhammad. So it doesn't always get away from him. Of course, here we're going to have Bush Clinton again next year. So what's the difference, right? But you have variations of it. And so what happened was the caliphate, the Abbasids took over, and the caliphate was moved from Damascus to Baghdad. And Baghdad became the center of the world. It was the largest functioning city outside China in the world. And a lot of good things had happened there. It was cosmopolitan. The whole idea that you had to be Arab in order to be in charge of things was broken down. And so many other, that's the first time we have many other people coming into Islam. So you have, and I put that on the list, cosmopolitan politics, political equality to some extent, de-Arabize Islam, but you also had imperialism. The Abbasid Caliphate then took colonial possessions around the Indian Ocean world and in Egypt and even as far west as Algeria and Morocco and Spain, and a lot of other things that happened. The ISIS is trying to, as part of its ideology, and many Arab people and even non-Arab Muslims know about the Abbasid revolution, to use the symbols of the Abbasid revolution to attract members. one of the main symbols of the Abbasid revolution was the black flag. The military advances of the Abbasids were always led by someone carrying a black flag. That may even go back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad, I'm not sure. But this use of the black flag, most governments don't have black flags. They have green, red, blue, yellow, orange, but generally not black. So this is a distinctive marker. Also, lightning military tactics, and tactics that sow fear in the enemy and make the enemy want to run away. Especially in Iraq, that wasn't hard because the Iraqi army was not very good, but to cause people to shrink. So someone asked before about the burning of that hostage, the Jordanian pilot, and I really still can't figure that out, why they would do that, other than to enrage the Jordanian population or the king of Jordan and cause exactly what's happening. I have very good friends. I took students to Jordan for 3 or 4 years. We don't go to Jordan anymore because I don't want my students taken hostage in Jordan. It's a very real possibility now. There's going to be a war in Jordan soon. The Jordanians are bombing ISIS now, but that's not going to work. Unless Jordan agrees to put troops on the ground to fight ISIS under the banner of the king, if that doesn't happen, because there are many people in Jordan that actually sign up for or are attracted by these symbols that ISIS is using. So they are using the lessons of the Abbasid revolution to try to recreate this thing. There's a group there that's not really connected with ISIS, but it's important. It's called the Khorasan group, which is based in Syria. And Khorasan was where the Abbasid revolution started, which is actually in eastern Iran, and mostly non-Arabs. And the non-Arabs came in and took over and established Baghdad as an important place. One of the things that ISIS is ignoring about that era, and that it's important, Baghdad contributed much to our civilization in terms of science. If you take astronomy, for example, and you look at the names of the stars, most of the names of the stars are in Arabic. They mapped the universe in terms of the stars. They established hospitals, orphanages, and all kinds of other scientific endeavors that were important. There was literary and artistic excellence in the community at that time, poetry especially, and other kinds of things that are important. An idea of rationalism, Islamic philosophy flourished, philosophical discussion flourished. A regime of tolerance, which ISIS doesn't seem to have, and a notion of progress, that we want to make progress in our society, which ISIS also seems to be ignoring. And I put 3 kinds of progress on the board. Material progress, to improve our material lives, but also moral progress, the idea of a discussion about morality. And so that leads me to the question I asked, which is, maybe this thing that we are so, it's like a boogeyman, this thing that we have ISIS now, is really not what it says it is. It says it wants to establish a caliphate and to revive this glorious days of the Abbasid Caliphate, but it might be just a passing cult. Because the burning of that hostage and the other kinds of things that they've done don't really, and the things they're ignoring about the good things about the Baghdad Caliphate don't make sense. So it may not be a cult, but it's just, the question is open, I can't answer it. Because you have to know what the difference is. Yeah, we had Jim Jones came, you know, all the people took, poison and all died. Waco, Texas, you had this David Koresh, this kind of thing that happened recently. You have other cults around that, you know, that have various behaviors, and it might be that we just have to wait and see. No one's sure yet. It's definitely not a caliphate in the Islamic approach. For example, the way that you choose the caliph under the Islamic approach is by election. Election of notables, it's not democratic election, but election of notables in the community, whereas this fellow has appointed himself as in charge without asking anybody. And so I don't think war is the answer. Although, especially when it comes to slavery, I had Frederick Douglass on my lapel here, and Frederick Douglass had a good message about slavery. The best way to deal with slavery is to put a gun to the slaveholder's head and tell him to stop, to use force, escape, and the like, and so we may have to use force, boots on the ground, real physical force to eliminate this circumstance. But ultimately, my message is that war is not the answer, because there are many, many, many other groups who have these problems, suffering because of these issues that I've described, that will just pop up. So if you eliminate ISIS today, there will be another one tomorrow, until the root causes of these circumstances are dealt with, have to be dealt with. A lot of it depends on what Muslims do about it. It's not really your problem, but it's going to affect you, and it's going to affect your grandchildren, like it affects my grandchild as well. So that's really my talk, and I'm very happy that you've been patient and listened and see if I have any other thing. That's pretty much what I want to say. Some things I skipped over, but that is what that's my approach to the problem with ISIS.
I have a question.
Sure.
Are you familiar with this book?
Yes.
Would you tell the audience what it is?
It's a biography of the life of the Prophet Muhammad.
Would you say that both Shia and Sunni agree that this book, written in the year 720 by Ibn Ishaq, still in publication,
Right.
is the most authentic biography of Muhammad?
Well, it's a authentic, well, I'm not sure about its authenticity. I'm not an expert on this particular book. I know the book.
I know it's before you and I were born.
Right. Right. But it's not a source of religious doctrine. So, like, for example, let me give you an example. One of us could write a biography of Thomas Jefferson. Would that biography of Thomas Jefferson be cited by a federal judge on some principle of law? The answer is no.
That wasn't my question.
Okay.
My question was, do most Muslims consider this to be the most authentic biography? That's a yes or no.
Well, Muslim, it depends. The question is a little, assumes things that may not necessarily be true. First of all, most Muslims are probably not familiar with that book. Most Muslims get information about the life of the Prophet Muhammad from hadith and not from the biography.
This was a long time before the hadith.
That's correct, but it's not
the hadith
right.
of Al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim.
Right.
I am not speaking from ignorance. Now, the reason I asked you about this book, you talked about the roasting of the Jordanian pilot alive.
Right.
And you expressed abhorrence and ignorance of something like this.
Right, it's a very abhorrent act.
I asked you to read from page 515 of the most authentic, considered by me, at least what I...
It's just a biography of the Prophet Muhammad written by someone who was interested in writing a biography. It is not a legal source. So, for example, if if you want to ask whether it's lawful to burn alive a prisoner, you don't go to this book.
But you go to Muhammad.
No, you go to Hadith.
No, you go to Muhammad.
No, you go to Hadith. And the Quran as well. And the Quran says, as well as many, many Hadith, say that I thought I had this podium. Can you, why don't you, if you want me to read it, I'll read it, but I would prefer that you sit down, because if you were in my house and you were speaking, I wouldn't come up like and take it over like this.
I apologize.
I don't want you to take it over.
I thought that you were very considerate of others.
I am.
Okay, I'm just
So you can ask me what you want, but I'd rather keep the podium.
Then we start.
Okay, okay.
Start right here. So the apostle.
I'm not going to do that because I don't think it's helpful to read from a biography. It was as if you were going to talk about some legal point in the U.S. and you asked me to read a biography of Thomas
What it
Jefferson.
says, and he doesn't want to read it. So with your indulgence, I will read it. So the apostle gave orders to Al-Zabariah, torture him until you extract what he has. So he kindled fire with flint and steel on his chest until he was nearly dead. In other words, in front of the apostle, the guy was roasted alive. Then the apostle ordered him to struck off his head.
Right,
A religion of peace, I give you.
right. Now, if you look at Hadith on the treatment of prisoners, and if you look at the Quran on the treatment of prisoners, the Quran and the Hadith both say that prisoners have to be treated humanely and fairly. This chapter 47, verse 4 of the Quran, which is the Word of God, that chapter and verse, can I finish? That chapter and verse says, hold the prisoner until hostilities are concluded, or ransom him back to where you get the prisoner from. There's also a hadith, that is language from the Prophet Muhammad, which says that you should not punish anyone with fire, because that kind of punishment is reserved for God, and only for God in hell. So there are not very many examples, and this biographical example, I don't deny it might be one, but there are not many examples of people burning prisoners alive in Islamic history. And the Prophet Muhammad did not do that. If he did it, not often. That is not a source for law.
It's a lie.
But no, I'm not saying it's a lie. I don't know, I haven't investigated it. But it's not a source for the law. The Islamic law has very specific provisions as to how prisoners are to be treated. And that's why ISIS is not really a very good example of Islam, because the way they treated those prisoners is not in accordance with the law.
You say ISIS is not Islamic?
No, they're just Muslims, but they're not Islamic, no.
ISIS, you're judged by what you do.
Dwight, we're going to have to move on because we're running out of time.
Okay.
A couple other questions. I appreciate that. I think one of the questions we saw back there is how would you recommend we approach the ISIS problem, Doctor? I mean, what should we do now?
Well, that's a very good question. And I wish I had a good answer. I'll do my best. Political representatives that we have in Washington have to come to a judgment as to how to approach ISIS. You mentioned before, Professor Adikat, before lunch, the idea of dialogue. So now, for example, there was a meeting of Muslim scholars in Cairo, and in Cairo, and they directed a letter to Baghdadi, who was the head of ISIS. So, some effort in terms of developing Obama's idea of a coalition is to some extent useful, but the way they do the coalition is only coalition for war. So I would recommend a coalition for dialogue, some sort of coalition for dialogue, some sort of coalition to deal with some of these problems. Iraq right now is a complete and total corrupt and horrible backwater. Even the Shia groups in Iraq, we cannot trust. So dealing with the situation in Iraq and Syria in terms of dialogue might be one way. If, for example, we were to get eliminated the government that's currently in Syria, or have some sort of way that that government could be adjusted, many of those groups of which ISIS sprung out of, Al-Qaeda in Iraq sprung out of that, wouldn't have a beef. There are many of the Sunni tribes in Iraq who have a beef because the Shia come in and they do these very horrible things. So there's got to be some kind of dialogue. I think the most important dialogue has to come from the Muslim world rather than from the West, but somehow they're encouraging that kind of dialogue. Because I know there are many Muslims who were horrified by the burning of that pilot. That was probably the biggest mistake that ISIS has made in terms of the Muslim community. In spite of my friend over here's argument trying to say that all Muslims go around the world wanting to burn prisoners. That's just not true.
No, I said Mohammed did.
Right.
I said Mohammed did.
Okay, so some sort of coalition for dialogue would be, and to the extent you could talk to the political representatives you have to encourage that, or I don't know if there's a Muslim community here in San Antonio, but if there is, you might want to be talking to them.
We got time for one more question.
Just one more, did I go over time?
Well, yeah, that's okay. We got time for one more question. Now, why don't we get this young lady up here?
I'd like to ask this question.
So it's two questions.
Let me get this young lady up here, Amy. She was up here first. Go ahead, man.
If Islam is a religion of equality, explain the treatment of women, especially when it comes to genital mutilation and things along that line, and the rape and being worth 2 camels, et cetera, et cetera.
I don't know what you mean about worth 2 camels. I've never heard that, but it's a very good question. The genital mutilation is not an Islamic practice. Genital mutilation is done by Christians and animists, people who don't have a monotheistic religion, all over Africa and to some extent in Asia. It's not just Islamic, it's cultural. So genital mutilation is something which is not unique to Islam, number one. Number two, I agree with you that the Prophet Muhammad's mission of equality was incomplete, in that he had this vision of equality for women as well, based on how he treated women in his family and the circumstances, but it was incomplete. It's incomplete. So the message of equality has some room for work when it comes to gender equality. Much like other legal systems, the Jewish legal system has similar problems, where Jewish women find themselves, even some Christian legal systems have this problem with gender equality. It was common in other religions as well. So that's not unique to Islam, and I would say that I agree that gender equality is still something to be dealt with in terms of Islam. But it's not something that's just unique to Islam, the problem of gender equality. It's something that is it's something that has to be dealt with. Some of the Islamic the governments in Islamic communities have been better in terms of gender equality than others. Egypt is actually, even though it's autocratic, has been pretty good.
Turkey? At one
Turkey
time?
also. But in other places, gender equality, gender inequality
It's
is
right.
still a problem.
Yeah.
And remember that a female genital mutilation is an African and Asian problem and not just Islamic.